This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment.
You sent me your biggest hot takes on books and reading and literature so that I can react, argue with, and ultimately rate them. For the rating system, we are going to use the Periometer, which is a spice rating system from the UK chain restaurant Nando's. We can't use the actual thing because it's copyrighted, so we're just going to copy their basic structure. It goes mild, lemon and herb, medium, hot, and extra hot. So, let's get started. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Here we have a hot take by Febrile Nescient, and it reads, "All literature is just content, information. Radical stylistic differences only add entertainment value, but the main points the authors want to make can be clearly distilled from all content and put into bullet point format. If you care about learning utility and making progress and accurately understanding the world, or our best explanations of it more than entertainment, you don't even need to bother with literature, even the most famous pieces." So that's a pretty spicy take. I think I'll put that on hot, especially for a kind of more literary crowd, I suppose. There is a point to this. In fact, if you were to ask me 5 years ago, I probably would have told you something like this take. And I'll tell you the reason why I eventually stopped believing in it. So I think the underlying assumption in this is that all knowledge, or all important knowledge, is propositional, right? It can be distilled down into, as this person quite neatly puts it, bullet point format, or otherwise be enumerated in a set of propositions and propositional arguments. That was a position that I once held, and so I can kind of understand it, right? The worry, I think, behind that view of the world is that you don't want to let in lots of what we might call woo-woo nonsense, right? You want to have some way of discriminating between types of knowledge or acquisition that are worth your time and types of purported knowledge that are not worth your time. And one way of doing that is to say, well, everything worth knowing is the kind of thing that you can put in a well-formed propositional argument, and anything else is kind of nonsense or otherwise too woolly to really count. And I really sympathize with that, right? Because you can't let everything through the door. There has to be some kind of gatekeeping of what counts as full-blown things worth knowing, or things that are, admit of knowledge ascription. However, I do think there are important forms of knowledge that fall outside that. And a really good example of this, and this is Polanyi's classic example, is of riding a bike. I think I've brought this up before. Riding a bike is an example of procedural and tacit knowledge. That is, it's procedural in that I couldn't, explain to you in propositional form how I ride a bike, and I couldn't teach you how to ride a bike merely propositionally. And it's also tacit because even non-propositionally, I couldn't verbalize what exactly I'm doing. It relies on a whole heaps of implicit knowledge and kind of muscle memory and that kind of thing. So riding a bike is a classic example of something that we kind of want to call knowledge, or at the very least is useful to have, let's say, as an ability. If you want kind of, if you think knowledge is too controversial a label to put there, I'm not really married to the label. However, it's clearly worth knowing how to ride a bike in the same way that it's worth knowing how to do lots of things. Let's talk about, knowing how, let's say procedural knowledge. And I think that is the kind of thing that literature actually can be very good at, right? So one counter-argument to this kind of idea that the contents of a book, or the important contents of a book, is exhausted by its kind of point-by-point enumeration of its key themes and key ideas, is to say something like, well, you get some kind of procedural knowledge from it. And in fact, this is how people often defend the act of reading and the act of kind of engaging with fiction as a whole. They tend to say something like, well, you don't just gain a series of proposed propositions, you also get the experience of relating to characters and things like that. And that could be a way to kind of train your kind of empathy and your theory of mind, or what have you. So that's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is to say, well, even if it's true that you could take all of the propositional content of a narrative and kind of put it in a bullet point list, it's significantly more compelling when it's put in narrative form. And that's important, right? That's not like a trivial side constraint. That's a key part of not just presenting a proposition, but getting someone to absorb it kind of right into their bones, to kind of use a kind of metaphorical exploration of that. Like, I'm sure that right now there are loads of things and loads of kind of life lessons and propositional ideas that you will have that you won't have fully integrated into your life, right? Because to fully integrate an idea into your life does not just require a like proposition to be cognitively and intellectually accepted. It also requires there to be an internal drive-based, instinctive, emotional shove towards it. And I think that is one of the things that storytelling and fiction is great at achieving. So, I mean, this is kind of the reason why I think Jesus told parables, right? You know, when, regardless of whether you think Christianity is true or not, you know, I'm an agnostic, Jesus was one of the most successful teachers in history, and his stories and ideas have probably had more impact than literally every other thinker in history. So, you know, even from a secular perspective, the guy was really good at his job, let's say. And I think a big part of this is the fact that he tells parables. You know, you won't turn to, you know, halfway through the book of John and you'll find, well, you know, Jesus has got all his disciples sat around and he says, well, you know, premise 1 of my argument is this, premise 2 is this, and if we invoke modus ponens, we would find the conclusion that follows is this. I'm not saying those kind of arguments have no value. In fact, like, I love those kinds of arguments. But I think that one of the reasons why Jesus's teachings were so compelling and continue to be compelling for many people today is that they are wrapped up in these amazing narratives and parables. And this could be like a pro and a con, right? Because just because something is wrapped up in a compelling narrative doesn't mean that it is a worthwhile idea or that it is true. But it might mean that if the idea is true or worthwhile, then the narrative format is part of what will help it kind of sink into your soul, for want of a better term, and compel you towards action. There's even like, I think there's even some kind of data behind. I'm always like hesitant to cite psychological data because I know so much of it can't be replicated. But I have come across data that may or may not be replicable that suggests that when people kind of inhabit a character or inhabit a kind of figure in a narrative, that allows them to perform certain tasks with more ease. I think the one that they did was like they told children to kind of complete an exercise, and then they said, pretend you're Batman and complete the exercise. And the children who pretended to be Batman would kind of sit down and kind of grit at it for longer. And, you know, that's kind of a trivial example. But my point is that it illustrates that inhabiting characters and narratives is valuable, aside from the propositional content of the themes of a book, because they engage our affects and our instincts in a way that bare propositional arguments just tend to struggle with. You know, maybe you can be presented with a propositional argument and you'll change all your behavior on a dime, but I don't think that holds for most people. It certainly doesn't hold for me, unfortunately. So yeah, separate from the kind of fact that, as you point out, that reading something in a narrative can be more enjoyable, which I don't think is like a trivial constraint. You know, enjoyment is important, right? I think that can be kind of part of a justification for why, in addition to merely laying out a set of messages, a narrative story is like not just kind of like a decorative gloss on those messages. It adds something pretty substantive. I think it's important to like have beautiful experiences. You know, I wouldn't frame them in like strong metaphysical terms, like experiencing the beauty or the form of the beautiful. But you know, I would say that the subjective felt experience of beauty is very important. And I don't think it's arbitrary. You know, just because I think something is stance dependent doesn't mean that I think it's arbitrary. But I think I mentioned that before. So, but yeah, I'd say this is a pretty hot take. I disagree with it for the reasons that I've given, but I'd be interested to hear what you think. Because actually, you know, I think that people are very quick to dismiss this kind of perspective out of hand. And no, it does require an answer, right? It is not like a trivial thing. People often read this kind of thing and they just kind of say, oh, you know, this is anti-intellectualism. But like, that's not a response. Sometimes anti-intellectualism can be justified, right? That is not in and of itself a reason to reject something. You have to demonstrate that it has missed something. And I think I've done that here, but I'd be really interested to know what you think. And I'd be interested to kind of hear the other side. Because as I said, I held this position for a pretty long time, especially in my like hardcore logic years. So yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for this perspective, but ultimately I have come to disagree with it. But before moving on, I just want to take a quick moment to thank today's sponsors, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you'll know it can be a real pain. First, you have to find a domain name and then construct the entire thing, and there's always this underlying anxiety that you're messing it up and creating something that doesn't just look untidy, but actually looks unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They compress all of that into a single platform and use ready-made templates to take most of the complication and headache out of website building. Their block-based fluid engine editing system is also so easy to use and makes it simple to integrate anything you want into your website without having to master some elaborate coding language. And you can even edit it from your phone. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get a 14-day trial and 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video. Our next hot take is from Abigail R4672, and it reads, "The whole audiobooks don't count as reading debate is so pedantic and, in my opinion, ultimately boils down to the need to feel superior to others. Oral storytelling is intrinsic to the human experience, and it's so disappointing to see it so readily devalued. While I acknowledge that listening and reading comprehension are two different skills that must be developed separately, works like the Epic of Gilgamesh and Beowulf have not survived all this time only for book snobs to call listening to stories cheating." I think this is like a medium hot take. It might be a hot take. I see a lot of people really down on audiobooks. I'm quite pro audiobooks. I think that they're a very different way of engaging with things, but I don't see any reason why, there's no reason to demean them. I quite often listen to audiobooks in the gym or on walks, and I think it's great. I don't see any reason to write them off. I think that this might, again, just boil down to people using different words in the same way. We have this term reading that for a lot of people is restricted to the activity that is, having written words in front of you and engaging with that intellectually and emotionally, or emotionally, I suppose. And I think that people use that in the narrow way will obviously find the concept of an audiobook being reading to be like a misuse of that term. For other people, it's not. I just think this is an example of where people use the same word in different ways. It's similar to the stuff I said about the author's impact in interpretation and things like that. Because it doesn't strike me that there's kind of a right or wrong answer here. This is just a term in dispute. And I can see, arguments either way. Somebody might want reading to remain in this kind of restricted usage because they think that it is worth, for eminently sensible, pragmatic reasons, to cordon off a particular term to refer to reading as in engaging with written stuff. I can also see someone saying, no, the important thing that we want to denote when we're using the term reading is the absorbing of kind of information in some broad sense, or the absorbing of linguistic information, in which case audiobooks would seem perfectly legitimate to use under that definition. I don't think there's a right answer here. I do think it's worth having a term to refer to each of these things, because I think there are important differences, just phenomenologically. When I'm reading something that's been written down with my eyes, I can stop. I can kind of go back, turn the page back to read something twice in quick succession. I have a lot more control over the flow. I can also create my own tones, my own voices for characters if it's a novel. Or my own voice for the author if it's a nonfiction book, right? People still have authorial voices that come through, and sometimes that just manifests very naturally as a particular kind of sound in your inner experience. So I think there are things to do with reading that you don't get out of an audiobook. There are things to do with audiobooks that you don't get out of reading as well, because, for example, I can be doing other things with my eyes, or I can shut my eyes. Audiobooks are great if you have headaches. And I don't think that, you clearly still get something out of an audiobook. It's not like, you put your headphones in, you listen to an audiobook for half an hour and you're like, yeah, I got nothing out of that. I may as well have just been napping or scrolling on TikTok or something. There clearly is value and enjoyment to be found in audiobooks. And, historically, people read to one another quite a lot. A lot of the books that we talk about Nietzsche having read during his time when he was suffering from extreme headaches and literally couldn't read most days are books that were read to him by his friends. That's lovely. In fact, when a lot of my friends and I get together, we quite often will read one another snippets of stuff that we found interesting, or an article that we've recently found that we enjoyed and stuff. And that could be really, really fun. And that is essentially just like a live audiobook. So yeah, I think that demeaning audiobooks is silly. However, I am live to the differences between audiobooks and reading as a visual medium. And I think that it is worth having specialized terms for those, whether we have like a sub-term in reading, like visual reading and auditory reading or something like that. I don't really mind. It doesn't like bother me what particular terms we use. I do think it's worth having terms to refer to these things separately because they are separate enough experiences that I think that is like something that's worthwhile to be able to refer to with ease, if that makes sense, which is kind of the reason for having any referential term, I suppose. Okay, our next hot take is from Noah White, OF6PM, and it reads, "The intention of the author and what they meant is deeply important to understanding their work." And we had a lot of comments that were like roughly about this issue. So we had someone else saying that, you know, your own interpretation of a book is no less valid than what the author originally intended, and some other people concurring with Noah White here and saying that no, actually, what we are after in literary interpretation is the intention of the original author. So as a result, I think I'm going to class these all as hot takes because at the very least, like, although there's a lot of people agreeing with them, there's at least as many people disagreeing with them. And, you know, going through the comments, it doesn't seem like there is like a consensus either side in the context of my audience, which I think is quite interesting. I've not found much of a consensus outside there either. I think these are two pretty entrenched camps, which I think is a bit of a shame because in my view, I think this whole debate is kind of talking past one another, if that makes sense. Like, I think that there are things going for the idea that the author's interpretation does add something incredibly important to the way that we look at a text. I think partly because when we are reading language, so often what we're naturally doing, like is in just in the world of ordinary speech, like when we encounter language, when we hear it and when we read it, in just the context of everyday communication, we tend to do something like try to reconstruct the intended meaning of the person who has said or written something down. Like a lot of cognitive linguistics work kind of relies on this idea that you know, we're trying to work out what other people meant, and they're trying to work out what we meant by something, like language as a signal to intent. And so I think that's kind of what there is going for the intention of the author view. It makes interpretation incredibly kind of continuous with the way that we use and interpret language in everyday speech, which is a pretty considerable advantage, right? It is also plausible that in a lot of cases, like what we want from an interpretation is to tell the intentions of an author. Like that just is often a question people are interested in. And to that extent, it makes sense to embark on that task, right? Where I think this becomes, you know, two people talking past one another is because, of course, that's not the only aim you could outline for literary interpretation. People read books for all kinds of different things. Like I've mentioned this on the channel before. One of the things that you might want out of your own engagement with a particular work is to see whether it has a deep insight into your own life, for instance. And for that, the authority of the author actually seems to matter very, very little. Another potential intention might be, okay, what can this work tell me about a particular philosophical or social or cultural debate, right? That will be another aim you could go into with reading a text. In which case, yeah, it seems like the author's intention is significantly less necessary. You will be leaving something out by not addressing the author's intention, but as long as what you're leaving out is something that you weren't after in the first place, that's not necessarily a disadvantage. You know, a lot of the time discussions like this are couched in terms of what it takes to understand a work and whether a given interpretation is valid. And the reason why I think this is talking past one another is because I think that what those terms mean, like understand and valid and kind of similar evaluation labels, let's say. You know, you're calling something valid, it's basically just a fancy way of calling something good, at least outside of like a logical context, right? Where it has a particular technical definition. And so I think that when two people are using these with very different evaluation conditions, I think their meanings just do substantially change, right? Like if when I say a valid interpretation, what I mean is an interpretation that reconstructs the author's intentions. And when you say a valid interpretation, you mean an interpretation that can give someone a greater general insight into their phenomenological experience. Well, then like I could call something valid and you could say that's not valid. And like we wouldn't be disagreeing, right? We're just using the same word in different ways. I don't think there's like a deep disagreement here. I think similarly when people say things like, can you separate the art from the artist? And I think, well, surely that's just an empirical question. Like you can, if you can inhabit a certain mental state whereby you are in some sense engaging with the art while that mental state does not engage with the artist, and like vice versa, I suppose. So yeah, I don't know. That seems to me to be like an empirical question. I wouldn't be comfortable saying that like you definitely can't. I wouldn't be comfortable saying that everyone definitely can. And I kind of think similarly here, right? I get the wish for author intention to constrain interpretations, because like I think that the worry is, and I think it's a perfectly reasonable worry, that otherwise anything might go, right? The floodgates will open, you can have any interpretation you want, and there's no way of telling which interpretation is better than any other. But I just think that the reason why that is seen as a worry is because we group interpretations that are aimed at vastly different things under the same heading of understanding a work or interpreting a work, or we ask whether the interpretation is valid or not. And I just think that these labels are just incredibly polysemous, right? I think that we would do better to take a word like interpret and instead break it down into various different meanings. I think about this a lot when it comes to like literature around Nietzsche, right? You'll occasionally see people who their wish when engaging with Nietzsche's work, and I'm aware that like Nietzsche is more of a philosopher than a kind of fiction author, but he did write fiction and myth and poetry, so I think this is a relevant example, and also I think that the kind of issues are relatively similar. Take a Nietzsche interpreter like Thomas Brobbier, for example. Well, he is incredibly good and incredibly concerned with reconstructing what Nietzsche likely meant by various different terms. And he does this by being like the most knowledgeable person possibly in the world about Nietzsche's intellectual and philosophical context. So, if you read any Brobbier on Nietzsche, I've been reading a fair amount of it recently because I just think he's brilliant and it's like really kind of shifted the way I see Nietzsche. You will notice that he is constantly making reference to the books in Nietzsche's library. Which are the books with the most annotations? What are the annotations? Are the annotations praising? Are they making little innovations? And how does that relate, plausibly, to Nietzsche's written word and the likely intentions he had behind writing it? That is one way of interpreting Nietzsche. I think it's a very, very interesting and very rigorous and scholarly way of interpreting Nietzsche. You also have people like John Richardson, who does pay a lot of attention to what he considers to be Nietzsche's intentions. But, and he will freely say this at the beginning of his works on Nietzsche, he also wants to try and steelman Nietzsche, right? He wants to try and create the most rich and potentially systematic, though, I think systematic is kind of a fraught term here, but the most encompassing and insightful interpretation of Nietzsche possible, and one that makes out of Nietzsche, to the extent that one can, a rigorous and coherent thinker to quite a high standard, as well as being just incredibly rich and meaningful and insightful to read. That seems to be John Richardson's intention when he's approaching Nietzsche. Now, contrast that with someone look, I'm not massively familiar with Deleuze's interpretation of Nietzsche. I've read bits of it, but as I've said in the channel many, many times, post-war French philosophy, I don't think I just understand it at all. So I'm not going to proclaim that. So I'll instead reference a friend who is much more familiar with Deleuze and Deleuze's work on Nietzsche than I am. According to him, at least, when Deleuze is interpreting Nietzsche, most people take that to be Deleuze is paying a bit of attention to what Nietzsche likely intended, but is also using Nietzsche as a springboard for his own ideas, which in many ways is it's a different but equally incredible and worthwhile task. So yeah, I just want to preface that because I don't know, man. I'm trying to get to grips with this post-war French philosophy stuff, but it's so hard, and it's written in the exact kind of way that I really struggle with. I've been slowly trying to get better at it, but it's hard, long project. All that to say is that each of these three interpreters of Nietzsche are clearly after very different things. It's a sliding scale, but they are after different things when they go and try and read and write and interpret Nietzsche's works. And I think that's important, right? If someone like Brobbier was to say to someone like Deleuze, or at least Deleuze, according to my friend, you're not paying adequate attention to the kind of notes and marginalia in Nietzsche's writings and what our best evidence for Nietzsche's intentions are, well, then it will kind of be all in kind of, it would be entirely appropriate for Deleuze to say, well, that's just kind of not the thing that I'm after. That's like an equally cool task, but that's not what I want. Out of my engagement with Nietzsche. And I think that's fair. Like, I don't see any reason why we would need to pick one over the other. They both seem like interesting, worthwhile intellectual exercises. I mean, yeah, I think a similar thing regarding author's intent. I think that there are good reasons to be interested in what the author intended with a text, because that's an interesting question. I also think there are good reasons to want to stray from that and think about what, is also just insightful in the text or in the context of the text, etc., etc., etc. So I don't think that there's a real disagreement here. I think this is a confusion over language that is created by the fact that we use the same words like understanding and interpretation and interpret and valid and all that kind of stuff to treat a number of different tasks that are after very different things. And it makes no more sense to kind of evaluate one of these tasks by another task standards than it would to like demand a rigorous mathematical proof in the domain of empirical science, or alternatively to try and, demonstrate something in logic by an appeal to emotion. That kind of thing might be perfectly fair in poetry, but it's not the kind of thing that would fly in a mathematical logical context. I just think that we're kind of tying ourselves in knots here because we've used a word to refer to a number of different things that aren't actually the same activity, and we should just separate those out. I think that we should kind of, I just think we should subscript words like interpret and then just say our little scope of what we mean by interpret there. But I think, that would involve kind of changing the way that we write. So instead, I think we should talk about interpretation relative to an aim rather than interpretation like to core. I think that would just prevent people's wires getting crossed. Yeah, I suppose that's kind of roughly what I think about this. Having said that, I kind of am only tangentially familiar with the sort of death of the author stuff. I would like to research more about it because I'd like to make kind of full video on it. I think it's interesting. But yeah, kind of at first glance, at the very least, or with a kind of semi-informed opinion, I suppose, that would be my gloss on that. Okay, here's a hot take by Forsaken Damon, and it reads, "Movies are literature and are more efficiently impactful than books. Video games even more so." I mean, this is a scorching hot take, and there were a few people who gave some variant on this. There was another person who said that they thought that movies were superior to literature in every way. And yeah, this is a firmly extra hot take. Incredibly spicy stuff. I also really strongly disagree with it. But then again, I feel like I should put my biases on the table here. I don't spend a lot of my time watching films. I'm not like a film buff. I have films that I really enjoy. Like, I really enjoy the Cornetto trilogy. But I doubt that is the most sophisticated kind of viewing that film has to offer. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm not a very reliable source here, because in some ways, I think this would be a bit like me saying, oh yeah, I really disagree with this take, would be a little bit like a film buff who had never read any kind of classic or well-regarded literature being like, yeah, films are obviously better than literature in every single way. And it would seem very justified from their perspective, right? So I don't know, maybe I am in a poor position to argue this, but for what it's worth, I think there are a number of things that I think the medium of the book lends itself to that I think films and video games maybe aren't as naturally adept at. I'm not going to give a kind of principled argument whereby I say, there's something magical or mystical or a priori about books that allow them to do something that films and video games can't do. I think that would be kind of I think that we need pretty firm evidence in order to make an argument like that. But I suppose I think that there are certain things that books are very, very good at naturally that I'm sure that films and video games could also be good at, but I think that books find it easier to be good at. I mean, one thing is interiority. Interiority of character is something that books are extraordinarily well placed to do because you can get inside a character's head. And that, I think, means that psychological novels, for example, are brilliant in my view when done well. And I think it's something that I just think would struggle to be replicable in film form. I'm sure that there are film adaptations of The Red and the Black, for example, but so much of The Red and the Black is examining the psychological makeup of the protagonist, Julian Sorel. And I don't know, I can't help but imagine that would be much more difficult to transmit in film form. It'd just be much more, it would have to, there'd be lots of kind of long, weighty glances and looks and stuff, which would imply a kind of interiority, but wouldn't be able to get it in quite as much detail as I think we would in the book. Or at the very least, it would be much, much more difficult to. I do think that the video games point is very, very interesting. Like, I don't play many video games. I kind of play the 3 video games that I played a lot as a kid when I want to kind of relax and goof off. And as a result, I'm not like au fait when it comes to video game narrative work. But I can see that there's something in a video game that is at the very least kind of unique and valuable, which is that you're kind of a participant in the story in a very direct way. That's something you don't really get in a movie or in a book. And I kind of... Like, people keep recommending me what I assume are very, very good philosophical, story-driven video games, like Disco Elysium. People are always recommending me this, and I will play it at some point. I just don't have a lot of free time. But I imagine that probably utilizes player agency in a way that aids the story and the development of the themes, etc., etc., etc. And film and video games, they're both very new media. Like, they're very new ways of telling stories compared to books. So, I don't know, maybe we haven't found some of the most impactful and brilliant ways to utilize the media of films and video games in a way that we just had much more time to suss out things like the novel and the poem, or maybe not the novel, but like the book, the fiction book, and the poem and things like that. So, I don't know, that I think would be a good defense you can make of this take. I just think that there are things that relatively long passages of written words are quite good at conveying. One is like a complex philosophical idea, or just a complex idea, because ideas contain lots and lots of information, and information is just very, very efficiently transmitted by the written word in a way that I think would be more difficult visually. I think that's a potential strength of books, like conveying cognitively weighty information and ideas. Because visuals can convey a lot of information, but a lot of it is like I couldn't convey some of the complex ideas found in philosophical dialogues in The Plague, for example, without just reproducing that dialogue in film form. And that would be cool. I'm not saying that would necessarily detract from it, but that is like, in effect, just taking the stuff already in the book and then transferring it to film. It's not kind of utilizing the unique strengths of film, which I think, from my like limited knowledge, I think is kind of the incredibly interesting visual element that you can't get in a book, right? Like think about like framing in films, when there's it's very like comically crude example, but when a character feels guilty in a film and they might be like standing at a window and bars of shadow will be cast on their face by nearby objects to kind of symbolize how they feel imprisoned by their own actions. That's the kind of thing that if you were to write that out in a book, it would come across as really corny, but it kind of works in a film. I think there are things that films probably have over literature, but I also think there are just things that literature has over films. I would be very sad if either of these media and video games, I'd be sad if any of these media were to suddenly like evaporate, because I think we'd be losing something interesting and unique about their particular way of conveying their art form. I think absorbing a set of ideas or a narrative from a book is a different experience to absorbing it from a film. And obviously there are great films and bad books, and there are bad films and great books. I imagine that the media are particularly gifted at doing very different things. And I would really hesitate to say that one is like superior to another, because we just judge them by different criteria, I judge a film at least partly by the way that it utilizes visuals. I just simply do not do that in a book, right? I might judge their descriptions, but that's a fundamentally different kind of skill. I know, I think I very rarely have come across a film where I was like, oh, that conveyed a complex idea as well as a comparatively brilliant novel. But that's with the proviso that I don't think I've seen the best kind of films out there. And I'm sure that if like a gifted film student were to point me in the direction of some absolutely fantastic cinema, I kind of don't know where I would end up on the other side of this. So I do think this is a scorching hot take, but it's largely a scorching hot take merely in the claim that film supersedes literature in every single way. I think that a much milder and also much more plausible take would be that film is probably better at some things than literature, and literature is probably better at some things than film, and that we can't do a kind of linear ranking of media in quite the way that this kind of take implies. Nonetheless, I do think this take is really quite interesting, and I'd be interested to know if you are like more acquainted with the best video games and best films out there, what your take on it is, because in some ways I think I'm poorly placed to do so. Right, here's a hot take from Not Casper 109, and it reads, "Books after 1980 are bad." I think I disagree with this. I think this is like a hot-ish take. You find people on both sides of the aisle. I would disagree on this partly because I've read books published after 1980 that were good. I mean, a lot of Cormac McCarthy works published after 1980. I think that I've really enjoyed some of those. I think that there are certainly, like, if we're widening our scope from fiction to nonfiction, I think there are absolutely brilliant works of nonfiction that have been published since 1980 in academic philosophy and in various areas of study. So yeah, I would broadly disagree. However, I do think that there is a good thought behind a critique like this, which is that I do spend most of my time reading books that were published quite a long time ago, and there is a reason for that. I do think that classic books tend to be better, more enjoyable, more insightful, more philosophically rich than books published today. I don't think that's because of anything peculiar about books in the past. I don't think that's because, pre-1980, there was just this like golden age of intellect where you had the circumstances that produced these great geniuses and they abounded in greater numbers than they do today. I think it's just because the past has an advantage over the present because it was around a lot longer. So there's a bigger pool for you to pick from. And also because it's already any book that is still being read by relatively significant numbers of people today that was published 300 years ago or 200 years ago or even 100 years ago, there's been like an incredible vetting process. It's like survivorship bias, and survivorship bias is sometimes good. Survivorship bias can help separate some fantastic works from some less fantastic works over time. There is such a thing as standing the test of time as a work of literature. That doesn't mean that all classic works are better than all modern works. It just means that if you were going to like pick probabilistically, like if I had all literary classics in one bag and all modern books in another bag, and I kind of, equalize the number, then if you were to pick out of the bag of classic books, where we define a classic book as a book published a long time ago that is still relatively widely read today, I think you'd probably be more likely to come across a high-quality book just because that book has stood the test of time, as opposed to a sort of random sampling that is equinumerous of books that have been published like in the last 5 years, for example, because they haven't gone through the kind of inherent quality control of time. So yeah, I don't think that books after 1980 are bad. I think that you are more likely to come across great books before 1980, but I don't think that's anything to do with, like, you wouldn't have been more likely to come across them if you lived at that time, right? You would just be that. It's just that since we are looking back with the kind of benefit of decades and sometimes centuries of this kind of quality straining process that doesn't just test for quality, but it's one of the factors, we end up with some absolutely fantastic books. So yeah, I think it's complicated, right? I do think there are books published after 1980 that I think are really, really good. I know maybe this is a controversial take. I think like Sally Rooney's Normal People is pretty good. I really enjoyed it. I think like the punctuation stuff where she doesn't include speech marks was like kind of a pain. I think that works much better for someone like McCarthy than it does for her. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really good book. I do spend most of my time reading classics, but that doesn't mean that I think all books that are published today or published after a set date are bad. And even if I think that you're more likely to find good books before that date, it's not because of anything inherent to that time period. I think it's just because we've had this kind of natural filtration process. Okay, here we have a hot take by Nizir Alwi, and it reads, "One of the strangest developments in contemporary reading culture is the elevation of relatability into a primary measure of literary value. I've seen many readers praise characters by saying I could see myself in them, as though fiction's highest purpose is self-recognition. But literature has never been primarily a mirror. At its best, it is a device for encountering forms of consciousness that are not our own. In my opinion, a character does not need to be relatable, they just need to be intelligible. The distinction matters. Relatability is based on similarity. I recognize my experiences, desires, anxieties, or social circumstances in the character. Intelligibility is based on understanding. I grasp the internal logic that makes this character think, feel, and act as they do, even when I share none of their traits. The demand for relatability quietly narrows literature's possibilities. It encourages readers to evaluate characters according to proximity rather than insight. Characters become valuable to the extent that they resemble us. Yet many of the most enduring figures in literature are memorable precisely because they are unlike us. We don't need to become them, we need only to understand them. I think the goal is not making strangers familiar, but making strangers comprehensible without ceasing to be strangers. I think this is a pretty good point. I quite like a kind of middle ground, I suppose. This is just like entirely subjective. This is the characters that I have found incredibly interesting, are the ones that teach you something about yourself that you didn't know before. I find that a lot in Stendhal's work. In The Red and the Black, the character of Julian Sorel is in some ways fantastic at teaching you things about yourself that you may have put a kind of, I don't know, a romantic gloss on. You know, he often, for example, is attracted to people or attached to people because of like quite shallow motives, largely to do with things like ego reinforcement and stuff like that, which I think, if we're honest, is probably something that we do and don't admit to ourselves. I think that might be, like, I quite like relatability in that sort of sense. I think you're right, though. I think that it is a narrowing way of looking at literature. Like, clearly literature can do other things. I think that also, you know, I would even go so far as to say that, you know, characters don't even need to be fully intelligible. Sometimes characters can remain mysterious, and that in itself is interesting, right? I mean, something like someone like Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, we never really find out exactly what makes him tick. He has this kind of instinctive kindness and inability to understand impure motives and things like that. But it's not like we ever, like, we don't fully understand, or we can't fully internalize Mishkin's view of the world. It remains, I think, fundamentally quite alien. And I think that's quite interesting as well. You know, I think that's, yeah, I agree broadly that the elevation of relatability is, that there's possibly too much emphasis placed on it in recent years. I don't know if there's just always been too much emphasis placed on it, or if that's something that's kind of come to the fore kind of in just contemporary attitudes. But I do think that this observation probably goes beyond literature, actually. I think that we praise relatability in people, like, quite a bit too much. You know, I think about this regarding, like, influencer culture and stuff like that, and kind of, I don't know, celebrity culture more generally, where, like, if you look at what people praise certain celebrities for, like how they behave in interviews and things like that, the line people will often go to is like, oh God, they're just like me. And I don't know, I sometimes really like, you know, celebrities and characters specifically because they're not very much like me at all. And like, that's quite cool. You know, it's being exposed to a difference in character that I can nonetheless appreciate. I don't need to appreciate only things that are similar to me. I can also appreciate things that are like really, really alien to me. That can be really fun. So I kind of broadly agree there. I also think that, like, maybe this is a controversial take. By the way, I think this is probably like a medium spicy take, because I think that although people might read it and go, oh yeah, I think that actually it does, like, criticize a fair proportion of people. Where was I going with this? Yeah, maybe this is my own hot take. But, like, I don't mind when celebrities are really out of touch, and sometimes I really enjoy it. I think about this when I was reading like stories of what old aristocrats used to do. Like Lord Byron had like this menagerie of wild animals in his room at Cambridge. And I remember thinking, like, I would love for aristocrats and celebrities and people just do like weird shit like that. Like, I think that would be really fun. The royal family in the UK is always trying to convince us that they're like us. I think this is a mistake. I think they should lean into the fact that they are incredibly odd, insane group of people in an incredibly unique situation. Just like lean into that. And I kind of wish more celebrities did that. Just did a bunch of like weird nonsense because they wanted to. And they are in a position where, like, kind of perversely, I suppose, they have an absurd amount of resources to make that happen. But no, that's kind of a niche take. I know, but I do think that relatability is overstretched. Sometimes it's even overstretched by me. You know, I quite often praise books by saying, you know, you can kind of see yourself in this character. Normally, I mean that in a kind of revelatory way, as I was saying at the kind of beginning. But yeah, no, maybe this is a good good time for me to take stock. Because actually, I do really enjoy when characters are very, very different to me. But I also really enjoy when people are really different to me. You know, I think that in some ways, like, we naturally have a predisposition towards valuing and enjoying those things that are similar to ourselves and our interests. But there can be a real pleasure in embracing and rejoicing in difference. I know I love meeting people that are very different to me. A lot of my friends are very different to me. Some are similar, but some are like extraordinarily different. You know, the whole incredibly different demeanors, different interests, and all sorts. So yeah, I don't know. I kind of agree with this, not just as a literature take, but as kind of a life take. I think let's expand our prudential and moral palette to go beyond similarity and resemblance and relatability and towards celebrating, you know, people who are incredibly strange from our perspective, and we are incredibly strange from theirs. That being said, I do stand by the value of this slightly weaker form of relatability, whereby a character reveals something about you or about people you know, or about like the inner workings of a society or the phenomenology of a particular aspect of life, and they make you realize something that you weren't conscious of before, but does inform your experience going forward. So, I mean, if you mean that kind of relatability, I actually don't think that's underrated. But if you mean relatability as in mere similarity, then yeah, I do think that's incredibly overrated. Right, that's all we have time for today. If you want to see my series on bad philosophy takes, you can find them in this playlist, where I try to defend some of the worst philosophy takes that you guys have come up with. But otherwise, let me know what you thought of the format. Do you want to see another video like this? This was really good fun from my perspective. So, yeah, I hope to do another one of these soon. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.